He walked into court alone, facing charges that could destroy his future. But when this young black man chose to defend himself, no one was prepared for what happened next. What started as a routine trial turned into a courtroom reckoning that left a judge speechless and the system exposed. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs, the kind of ambient noise that disappears the moment something truly unexpected happens. And that moment was now. Everyone in Los Angeles County Superior Court, Department 14, was watching as a 22-year-old black man in a navy hoodie and black slacks stood calmly at the defendant's table, facing charges that would terrify most people twice his age. His name was Miles Jefferson, and on paper, he was everything the system didn't want to believe in: young, black, and accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Yet the way he stood, posture firm, eyes steady, hands loosely clasped in front of him, said something else entirely. He wasn't afraid. Not of the jury, not of the prosecutors, and certainly not of Judge Gregory Alden, the silver-haired arbiter perched above the courtroom like a hawk in black robes. Judge Alden was notorious in legal circles. To some, he was a man of discipline and efficiency. To others, especially those who didn't walk into his courtroom with tailored suits and Ivy League resumes, he was cold, impatient, and dismissive. The kind of judge who leaned into assumptions. He adjusted his glasses now, peering down at Miles with a mix of curiosity and faint amusement, as if wondering how long this one would last before folding under pressure. "Mr. Jefferson," Alden began, his voice flat but resonant, "you've been charged with the unlawful theft of a 2022 Audi A6 and resisting lawful arrest. How do you plead?" Miles turned his head slightly, his eyes flicking to his public defender, an older woman with kind eyes and a stack of notes she hadn't had the chance to read aloud yet. She had barely opened her mouth when Miles gently placed a hand on her forearm. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low but unwavering, "I'll be representing myself." A brief silence fell like a curtain. Then, from the gallery, a soft chuckle. It came from one of the junior bailiffs near the door. Another followed from a man in the back row wearing a suit and a smug expression, likely a paralegal or someone who thought they'd seen this show before. Even the court reporter lifted her eyes from her stenograph machine. Judge Alden didn't hide his reaction. He leaned back slightly, lips curling into something between a smirk and a sigh. "You'll what?" he asked, his tone laced with condescension. "I'll be defending myself," Miles repeated, his gaze never wavering. Thomas Richland, the prosecutor, shifted in his seat, the corners of his mouth lifting with poorly masked glee. He was in his early 40s, with a trim beard, a well-pressed navy suit, and the confidence of a man who'd been winning easy convictions for years. He didn't bother hiding the amusement in his voice when he leaned toward the jury and said, "This should be interesting." Judge Alden tapped his gavel lightly. "Very well. The court recognizes the defendant's right to self-representation. Mr. Richland, you may proceed with your opening statement." Richland stood like he was on stage, pacing slowly as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is a clear and straightforward case. On the evening of March 7th, the defendant, Mr. Jefferson, was apprehended by law enforcement following a high-speed pursuit through downtown Los Angeles. The vehicle in question, a silver Audi A6, was reported stolen just hours earlier. Inside the vehicle, authorities found fingerprint evidence directly linking Mr. Jefferson to the driver's seat. The arresting officer, Sergeant Marcus Reed, identified the defendant as the person he saw behind the wheel moments before the vehicle was abandoned. We will show you the evidence. You will hear the officer's testimony. And by the end of this trial, you will have no reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of both charges." He sat down with a flourish, like he just dropped the mic. The jury seemed attentive, some nodding slightly, others scribbling notes. Miles, however, remained still, unbothered. Judge Alden turned his gaze toward him. "Mr. Jefferson, you may begin your response." Miles stepped forward. He didn't shuffle papers. He didn't glance nervously around the room. He simply took a slow breath and turned toward the jury. "Before we begin," he said, "I'd like to address one thing directly with the prosecution." Judge Alden raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Miles turned to Richland. You said that Sergeant Marcus Reed witnessed me driving the stolen vehicle. Is that correct? Richland nodded, clearly ready for this part. That's what's in his sworn statement. Miles gave a slow, deliberate nod. And that statement is part of the prosecution's evidence? Of course, Richland replied, his tone mildly impatient. Then, Your Honor, Miles said, turning back to the judge, I respectfully request that the court subpoena Sergeant Reed's GPS logs from the night of the incident. According to his statement, he witnessed me in the car. But I have strong reason to believe he wasn't even in proximity to the vehicle when it was spotted. Now it was Richland's turn to stiffen. His fingers tapped restlessly against the edge of the prosecution's table. A few jurors looked up, interest piqued. Objection, Richland said, though there was hesitation in his voice. The defense is speculating. I'm not speculating, Miles said smoothly. I'm asking to verify whether the statement matches the officer's physical location. If it does, great. If it doesn't, then we have a problem. Judge Alden tilted his head slightly, visibly intrigued despite himself. Does the prosecution have any issue with obtaining the officer's GPS data for that evening? Richland hesitated, just long enough. The room noticed. The jury noticed. Miles definitely noticed. No objection, Richland finally muttered. Then it's granted, Alden said, scribbling something on his pad. With the courtroom now quiet, Miles continued. Let's talk about the fingerprint evidence, he said. You're going to hear that my prints were found on the steering wheel. Sounds convincing, right? But let me ask you something. If you walk into a department store, try on a jacket, and put it back, and later that jacket goes missing, are you automatically guilty of theft because your fingerprints are on it? A few heads in the jury box nodded, as if connecting dots they hadn't considered before. Miles didn't push. He let the moment breathe. Then he said, what the prosecution won't tell you is that this car was sitting unlocked outside a 7-Eleven at 3:40 p.m. I was there with friends. I leaned on the car, opened the door for a second, curious, dumb, whatever. I never drove it. Never took it. I walked into the store and bought 2 bags of chips and a Sprite. There's surveillance footage of that. We'll get to it. Judge Alden was leaning forward now, elbow on the bench, watching with a sharpened interest. Even the smug bailiff at the back had gone still. Miles turned back to Richland. Now, about the forensic expert. Can you confirm for the court whether or not the forensic analyst who examined the fingerprints is scheduled to testify? Richland looked like he'd swallowed something sour. They were not called. So, Miles continued, voice calm as ever, you're asking this court to convict me based on fingerprint evidence that no expert is here to defend? No cross-examination? No explanation of chain of custody or methodology? The silence was louder than any objection. Then Miles dropped the last hammer. One more thing, Your Honor, he said. I'd like to enter into evidence a signed statement from Mr. Harold Winston, the registered owner of the Audi. In his statement to police, he clearly said, and I quote, I saw the kid who took my car. He was white. Not the one they arrested. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Richland sat frozen. The jury shifted, murmuring among themselves. Judge Alden reached for his glasses and stared hard at the document Miles held aloft. And in that moment, everything changed. The courtroom was no longer laughing. They were listening. Every word from here on out would matter. And Miles Jefferson, young, underestimated, and unshakable, was just getting started. The courtroom, once brimming with arrogance and amusement, had turned quiet, eerily so. Miles Jefferson stood where he had before, in the exact same spot at the center of the storm, but everything around him had shifted. He could feel it in the air, heavy with disbelief. The jury, once settled into complacency, now leaned forward, eyes focused and sharp. Judge Alden, whose face had maintained a mask of bureaucratic boredom, now tapped his pen against his notes without rhythm, his brows pulled in, his lips pressed into a line. Even Thomas Richland, the prosecutor who earlier had oozed the confidence of a man filing paperwork for a conviction already secured, had gone visibly still, rifling through his documents like he was searching for a lifeboat. And Miles, the calm, steady Miles, stood ready to tip the scales even further. "Let's talk about fingerprints," he said, his voice low but crisp, carried across the courtroom like a clean cut through fog. "You'll hear that mine were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. That's true. That part's not in dispute. But here's what we need to ask: does the presence of fingerprints equal guilt? Or could it simply mean contact?" He took a single step forward, just enough to mark his presence again. If you walk into a store and try on a pair of sunglasses, and someone comes along later and steals them, does that make you a thief because your prints were there? No? Then why is that logic acceptable here? A murmur rustled from the gallery. One of the jurors, an older woman in a gray cardigan, tilted her head slightly, the gears in her mind clearly turning. Miles seized the shift. The prosecution is banking on the idea that you won't question it. That you'll hear fingerprints and stop thinking. That you'll ignore the fact that this vehicle was parked, unlocked, outside a 7-Eleven just hours before it was reported stolen. He let the words hang for a breath, then continued. "I was there. With 3 of my friends. We walked right past that car. I was curious. I looked inside. I opened the door. I touched the wheel. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal it. I didn't even get in." Miles turned to the jury box, locking eyes with each member one by one. Was it a stupid decision? Probably. But being curious isn't a crime. Touching something isn't stealing it. And assumptions aren't evidence. Across the aisle, Richland stood slowly. "Your Honor," he said, his tone tight, "we ask that the defendant stick to the facts presented in discovery. He is drawing conclusions that have not been formally established." "Actually," Miles interjected smoothly, "I'd be happy to introduce the 7-Eleven surveillance footage from that afternoon. Footage the prosecution already has but conveniently didn't present. The timestamp matches my location. You'll see me enter the store. You'll see I'm not in the vehicle. You'll see I was nowhere near it when it was taken." Judge Alden blinked. "Is that true, Mr. Richland?" The prosecutor hesitated. A beat too long. Then nodded. "It's part of the broader video archive, Your Honor." "But, then it should have been included," Alden snapped, sharper than he'd sounded all day. The courtroom was listening now. They weren't here for a spectacle anymore. They were here for the truth. Miles stepped closer to the judge's bench, not to challenge, but to focus. "Your Honor, I have another point to raise. According to the prosecution, this entire case leans on 3 pieces of evidence: Officer Reed's statement, my fingerprints, and their implication of motive based on proximity. We've already questioned Reed's location, pending GPS verification, and we've shown that fingerprints aren't definitive proof. Now let's talk about forensic analysis." Judge Alden leaned back, one hand rising to his temple. "Proceed. Is the forensic expert who processed those fingerprints in the courtroom today?" Miles asked. "Were they subpoenaed?" Richland stood again. "No, Your Honor. Their testimony was considered non-essential." "Non-essential?" Miles repeated, letting the word echo like a bad joke. "So the state is comfortable using forensic evidence to try to convict me, but not comfortable allowing me to question the methods used to gather or analyze it. No opportunity to challenge chain of custody? No explanation of how many other prints were in that vehicle and ignored. This court is being asked to convict a man based on science, without ever hearing from the scientist." This time, the jury reacted audibly. Someone on the front row leaned back in their seat with a quiet exhale. One of the bailiffs glanced toward the back of the room. Even Judge Alden's pen stopped moving. "Your Honor," Miles said, quieter now, but every bit as firm, "it's not just about what's been presented. It's about what's been left out. And I'm not done yet." He reached for his folder. I'd like to submit a signed statement into evidence. It comes from Mr. Harold Winston, the registered owner of the stolen Audi. Richland rose so fast his chair scraped the floor. Objection. That statement was never authenticated. Actually, it was. Miles cut in. It's part of the initial police report from the night of the incident. The prosecution chose not to include it. I have the timestamp, badge ID, and report number. I've made copies. He handed a set to the bailiff, who delivered them to the bench and jury. In this report, Miles continued, Mr. Winston states that he saw someone jump into his car while it was running outside a gas station. He describes that person as white. Shorter than me. Wearing a baseball cap. Miles looked back at the jury. I don't own a baseball cap. I don't fit that description. But that didn't stop anyone from arresting me 2 hours later, a few blocks away, walking home with a Slurpee in my hand. The courtroom was absolutely still. Even the judge's gavel sat untouched, forgotten. Miles took one last breath. This is what happens when we stop asking questions. When we assume guilt because someone looks like a suspect instead of actually matching one. When we ignore evidence that doesn't fit a narrative. This isn't just about me. It's about the next kid. And the next. If we're going to use the law as a sword, it better be sharp enough to cut through bias too. He stepped back, letting the weight of it all fall where it needed to. Judge Alden didn't speak right away. His face was still, hands clasped in front of him. When he finally looked up, it wasn't with the usual impatience. It was something else. Something closer to thought. Miles turned and returned to his seat. The jury sat frozen, mind spinning. Across from him, Richland shuffled papers, the confidence he wore earlier now fractured under the weight of a story he could no longer control. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. Judge Alden hadn't moved for several seconds after Miles Jefferson returned to his seat. The courtroom hung in that strange silence where no one dares breathe too loud, as if even air might tip the balance. The judge's fingers rested on the edge of his bench, his thumb tapping just once before going still. His eyes, once full of boredom and quiet dismissal, now steadied Miles with an unreadable weight. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Thomas Richland shifted uncomfortably in his chair, flipping through the same stack of documents he had referenced earlier, though everyone in the room could tell it was out of habit now, not purpose. The illusion of control was gone. Miles had dismantled the prosecution's narrative one deliberate piece at a time, first the GPS logs, then the fingerprint logic, and finally the explosive police report stating the real suspect was a white male. It hadn't just created reasonable doubt. It had turned the courtroom upside down. Judge Alden exhaled through his nose and leaned forward, elbows on the bench, his voice heavier than it had been all day. Mr. Richland, he said slowly, do you have any further evidence to present to this court? The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. The weight of a dozen eyes, jury, spectators, media, and his own staff, was too much. He swallowed hard and shook his head. No, Your Honor, he said. The state rests. There was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. A crack in the polished armor. A concession not just to the court, but to the truth. Alden nodded slowly, then turned to the jury box. Given the developments presented, he began, his voice now clear and authoritative, and the failure to establish a consistent chain of evidence, the conflicting testimony, and the introduction of a signed witness statement that directly contradicts the state's allegations, this court finds there is no sufficient basis to proceed with this prosecution. A murmur rippled through the gallery, spreading. Like a slow wave, swelling toward the walls. Someone gasped. A woman near the back covered her mouth. One of the jurors leaned back in his seat, stunned. Miles didn't move. He sat completely still, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward. He had prepared for this moment in his mind 1,000 times. The dismissal wasn't a surprise, it was the justice he had fought for. Judge Alden reached for his gavel, and with one solid strike against the block, spoke the words that would echo in that room forever. Case dismissed. Then came the chaos. A soft explosion of whispered disbelief, of hushed exclamations, and the squeak of chairs as people turned to each other. Some clapped, tentatively at first, then firmer. Others simply stared. The courtroom had been prepared to watch a young black man be convicted. What they witnessed instead was a young black man expose the cracks in a system that had underestimated him. Reporters who had sat in the back row mostly out of obligation now fumbled for their notepads and phones. Flashbulbs began popping before Miles even stood up. Microphones were already pointed toward the aisle as he rose quietly from his seat, gathered his folder, and turned without a word. He didn't smile. He didn't bask in the spotlight. His steps were deliberate as he moved past the rows of stunned spectators. The moment was not about theatrics. It was about truth. A bailiff tried to stop him near the door, clearly unsure of protocol when the defendant walks out the victor. "Sir, Mr. Jefferson, any comment?" another reporter called out. "Do you plan to sue?" another shouted, shoving a microphone close. Miles didn't answer. He simply raised his hood and kept walking. As he reached the wide marble staircase leading down from the courthouse steps, the sunlight hit his face. The noise of the city returned, cars honking, the low hum of traffic, a far-off siren. It was the sound of a world that had kept turning even as his had stood still for months. At the bottom of the stairs, she was waiting. His mother stood with her arms crossed, not in anger, but the kind of restraint born from a mother trying not to cry in front of cameras. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The moment their eyes met, she stepped forward and wrapped him in the kind of hug only a mother can give, a hug that carries years of sacrifice, nights of prayer, moments of fear she'd never dared speak aloud. "You scared me half to death," she whispered into his shoulder. Miles gave a small smile, resting his chin lightly atop her hair. "I had to take the shot, Ma," he murmured. "I couldn't just stand there." She pulled back slightly and looked up at him, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. "You always were stubborn," she said. "Just like your grandfather." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he said softly, but he never got his day in court. The media was swarming by now, forming a wall of bodies and questions. But Miles and his mother slipped past them, moving toward the edge of the sidewalk where a silver sedan idled. As they reached the car, Miles turned his head slightly, just enough to catch movement on the courthouse steps. Judge Alden stood there alone, watching. No staff beside him, no lawyers flanking his position. Just him, in his robe, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, not in disdain anymore, but in something that looked almost like regret. Or maybe recognition. Their eyes locked. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't warm. It was honest. A long pause passed between them, stretching the space between two men who had entered that courtroom from very different worlds. Then Alden called out, not loud, but clear enough. "Mr. Jefferson." Miles turned his body toward the steps, but didn't move forward. "You ever think about law school?" the judge asked. A few heads turned. Even some of the press paused mid-question. Miles stood still, one hand on the car door. He didn't answer immediately. Just let the question hang in the late afternoon air. Then, slowly, he gave a small smirk, the kind that says you're already 5 steps ahead. "I'm already thinking about it," he called back. "Been thinking about it." The judge nodded once, and that was the end of it. No apology. No grand gesture. Just a shift, a turning of the page. Miles slid into the passenger seat, his mother behind the wheel. As they pulled away from the courthouse, the chaos behind them blurred into the background. Cameras, headlines, speculation, it was already spiraling. But Miles wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about every kid who'd been through that courtroom without the chance to speak. About every person who never got to challenge the assumptions stacked against them. Today wasn't just about a dismissal. It was about exposure. A system that had been forced, for once, to look at itself. And blink. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But Miles Jefferson was ready. Because the next time he walked into a courtroom, he wouldn't be sitting at the defense table. He'd be standing at the front. And this time, he'd have the credentials to match the voice he'd already proven he had. As the author of this story, I want to take a moment to reflect on the deeper message behind Miles Jefferson's journey, a young black man who stood alone in a courtroom, surrounded by doubt, bias, and assumptions, and still chose to speak truth with courage, clarity, and purpose. The lesson here is powerful. Do not let the world define your worth based on what they see or assume. Miles wasn't just defending himself against false charges, he was confronting a system that too often looks at young black men and sees guilt before innocence, attitude before intellect, threat before humanity. But he didn't fight back with anger or aggression. He fought back with knowledge, with calm, with undeniable facts. And that changed everything. This story reminds us of the importance of being prepared, being thoughtful, and being brave, especially in spaces that weren't built for us. Miles didn't get lucky. He didn't stumble into victory. He studied, he listened, and when the time came, he spoke not just for himself, but for every voice that had been silenced before him. It's a reminder to never underestimate someone just because of their age, their skin color, or their background. It's also a message to those in power, judges, prosecutors, officers, and educators. Your assumptions can cost lives, careers, and futures. What if Miles hadn't known his rights? What if he hadn't been strong enough to speak? How many others have stood in his place and never been given the chance to prove their truth? To our listeners and viewers here at US Instructive Stories, thank you for taking the time to experience this journey with us. Stories like this matter because they reflect real struggles, real injustice, and real resilience happening across America every day. Whether you're a student, a parent, a teacher, or a public servant, we all have a role to play in building a justice system that is truly just. If this story moved you, share it. Start a conversation. Talk to your children, your coworkers, your community. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're underestimated, misjudged, or treated unfairly, remember Miles Jefferson. Remember the strength it takes to stand tall when the system expects you to fall. And know that your voice, your truth, and your courage can change everything. From the entire team at US Instructive Stories, thank you for listening, for thinking deeply, and for caring. We're honored to have you with us. Keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, keep standing.